François de Villiers ha sido un presentador de hebreo bíblico en el Instituto de Estudios Bíblicos de Israel desde el 2009. Vive en Sudáfrica actualmente. Y fue entrenado originalmente para ser ministro de una iglesia. Él ha estado haciendo eso durante 15 años antes de convertirse en un profesor de tiempo completo. Sus intereses incluyen la traducción bíblica, traducción teórica, y la crítica textual. Actualmente él está cursando un doctorado en la Universidad de Stellenbosch y está enrolado en un programa en un Master's Degree en traducción de la Biblia en la Universidad de Free State de Sudáfrica. Déjenme un minuto. Let's see if Jaime can get... Okay. Francois de Villiers has been a lecturer of Biblical Hebrew at the Israel Institute for Biblical Studies since 2009. He lives in South Africa. He originally trained for church ministry and was in ministry for 15 years before turning to teaching full-time. His interests include Bible translation, translation theory, and textual criticism. He holds an MD degree from the University of Stellenbosch and is currently enrolled for an MA degree in Bible translation at the University of the Free State in South Africa. Welcome, Francois, and thank you for being with us. Now the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the honor to be here. I really appreciate it and hope that what I can contribute will be meaningful for your conference. Okay, I'm just going to share the screen. Here we go. Before I start, I just do need to give some recognition before I do anything else. I've listed there the bibliography of 3 articles. Obviously, there are now more that a person could have referenced, but these are the 3 central articles, to reference if you want to find out a bit more about some of the things that I'm going to talk about. Now, the first thing, I think the most difficult type of translation, or one of the most difficult type of translation, is if you are trying to translate an ancient text, which is far removed from modern readers in time and in space and culture, and you try to make it relevant for today. And at a stage, translation theories were dominated by the concept of equivalence. And equivalence basically comes down to, different theorists had different definitions of what equivalence is. And they would often use that to determine, is this now a good translation or is this now a bad translation? But the more and more, all of us realize that if you are in translation, it is impossible to produce a translation which is a mirror copy of the original text. So what happened is some people started to become more interested, not in equivalence necessarily anymore, but they tried to ask, okay, let us maybe take a few existing translations and describe what did the translators actually do in order to achieve that bridge between the ancient culture and the modern text. And what I'm going to try to do in my presentation is I'm going to try to do that for a specific Bible translation of a specific text. So I'm going to try to give a description of the contemporary English version. It's an English language Bible translation, and how they rendered Psalm 85. Now, before we read the text, it is important maybe just to make a few comments about descriptive studies and the contemporary English version especially. CEV, that's how they abbreviate it. The English Bible, it is an English Bible translation. It was produced in the late 20th century, so you're talking about 1994, 1995. And its primary function was communication, and it is part of a Bible translation type. It is a group of Bible translations that have the thing in common that they use simplified language. The policy of such a translation, if you use a translation team and they have a policy about how they are going to translate, they strive to produce a translation which will be understandable for someone who maybe has the reading level of a grade 4 school learner, whether that's now a first language or second language speaker, I'm not entirely sure. But this is the idea what they strive for. And what made the English, the contemporary English version, the CEV, unique at the time, is that it was not a simplified language version, which is a paraphrase of existing English. You will find that in the English-speaking world and the Bible reading community of the English-speaking world, there are quite a few translations out there that present themselves that they are simplified language or paraphrase and so on. But usually what happens is that somebody took an existing English translation. Remember, the Bible was now written, or the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So what people would do is they would take an English translation of the Hebrew, which is already a translation. And what they would do is they would simplify that and then present that as if it were a translation. And what made the CEV unique is that it chose to translate directly from the original source text, the Hebrew Bible for the Old Testament and the Greek New Testament for the New Testament. And something which is also important about the CEV, and you find that many modern Bible translations do that, they usually formulate that they have a certain purpose in mind and a certain audience in mind. And the translators of the CEV formulated it that they felt that in reality, many people listen to the Bible far more than they actually read it for themselves. So the type of translation that they tried to produce was a translation that must be easily understood when it is listened to. So when somebody just hears it and the person hears it for the first time, it must be easily understood. Another thing is that if a person then should read it aloud, the person who reads it must feel that he or she does not stumble. So the language must be easy to read aloud as well. And what also makes the CEV very unique, and this is what I take a special interest in, is the way that they present Hebrew poetry. What will happen is in many English language Bible translations, what they do is they will, they will present the text almost like columns in a newspaper. And they would present it. But whether what you are reading is a normal story or history, or whether it is a poem, it would not matter. It would still be written almost in the format of a newspaper article, usually 2 columns on a page. And this caused very often that readers could not always distinguish, are they reading a story? Are they reading poetry? Are they reading a letter? What are they reading? But the contemporary English version tried its best to make sure people realize that what they are reading is poetry. And they did this especially in the way that they printed the lines when they translated poetry, and you will see it in a moment when I have us look at Psalm 85. And they try to measure the lines in such a way that they will, each line will be a self-contained unit. So something that is important, in the Bible speaking, in the Bible reading community and in many churches, people often have very strong ideas about what a Bible translation should be and what is the correct translation and how does it should be. And you find very often in the English-speaking world anyway, that your more literal Bible translations, like the King James Version, for example, or the Authorized Standard Version and things like that, those translations tend to be very literal. They tend to be translated word for word from the Hebrew into English. And in some communities, those translations, it is as if they carry more authority than simplified language such as the CEV. And it is important then to realize that when the CEV presented its translation, for them the most important, their primary concern was meaning. Is it easy to understand the meaning? And is it easy to process when you read it? Is it easy to read? And this causes, one must realize that the CEV is what one would call a domesticating translation. A foreignizing translation is a translation that somebody would present, and they deliberately want the audience to realize, look, this is an ancient text. The people of the time thought differently. They looked different. They spoke different. Their culture was different from ours. And the translation will then usually contain those elements. People will read a translation and immediately feel, oh, well, this is definitely a text from another world, right? But the CEV was not like that. They tried to present this as a fully understandable, easy to read English text. And this causes that sometimes people might even read the CEV and think that it in itself is an original text, which it isn't. So that's now one of the, well, some people feel it should be like that. Other people consider it as something negative. The reality is just a person should realize the CEV would be a domesticating translation as opposed to a foreignizing translation. What I would like to present now is the actual text of Psalm 85 as it appears in the CEV, in the contemporary English version. And you see that I also maintain the page format. So everything that you see here is exactly the way it is printed in the CEV, including paragraph divisions, the titles, and things like that. So the page layout I retain here. And if I can just read it, it says, okay, Psalm 85, a psalm of the people of Korah for the music leader, a prayer for peace. O Lord, you have blessed your land and made all go well for Jacob's descendants. You have forgiven the sin and taken away the guilt of your people. Your fierce anger is no longer aimed at us. Our Lord and our God, you save us. Please bring us back home and don't be angry. Will you always be angry with us and our families? Won't you give us fresh life and let your people be glad because of you? Show us your love and save us. I will listen to you, Lord God, because you promise peace to those who are faithful and no longer foolish. You are ready to rescue everyone who worships you, so that you will live with us in all of your glory. Love and loyalty will come together. Goodness and peace will unite. Loyalty will sprout from the ground. Justice will look down from the sky above. Our Lord, you will bless us, and our land will produce wonderful crops. Justice will march in front, making a path for you to follow. And when I now continue with my presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss each verse. And what I will do is I will talk about the strategies that the translators used in order to produce their text. And this is now a summary from the article of Van Rooyen and Nodea, of which I had the reference up in the beginning. These are the translation strategies that I will be referring to. And you will find that very often, whether people do it intentional or not, these are the type of translation strategies that people follow, whether they are producing whether it's a translation of an ancient text or a modern text, it doesn't matter. The point is, these are the strategies. The first strategy that they refer to is that of transference. That is, if you take something from the source language and you transfer it directly into the modern receiver language. An example that I would like to read is this one, a satrap. Now, a satrap is a type of a governor of the ancient Persian and Median Empire. If you produce a translation that has now a foreignizing have a foreignizing effect. So people must read this and they must realize that this is a text from another world. You are going to keep the word satrap in there. Sometimes what somebody would do then, if they have an indigenizing domestication, they will use a more commonly known term, which is understandable for the audience. So then they will not say satrap, they will say it's a governor. Then sometimes you will see that people will feel no. Cultural substitution is one of the strategies. So what will happen is now they will choose not a satrap and not a governor either. They will, for example, say, okay, but in the country and the language which we are translating for, we have provinces and states and premiers. Then they might use the word premier even. Or they might decide they're rather generalized. They will not use the word satrap. They will not use governor. They will not use the word premier. They will use rather the word, this is just an official. Sometimes they will use a more culturally specific term. Then you use not a satrap, not a governor, not a premier, not a governor. You say the guy is a mayor or something like that, but you use a very, very, very familiar term. And the other possibility, if I can quickly just get my text to go up. Sometimes you might feel it will be necessary rather to leave the text untranslated. Then you will just say the person's name maybe, or you will say the guy is an official, or just the person's name, but you present it in a way that is formal enough that hopefully someone will realize, okay, this guy is important. Or sometimes it might happen that you are trying to translate in such a way, but you are freely reformulating. You have a source text that says certain things, and you are freely reformulating what it says to the point where you often write something in your translation which is actually not reflected in the source text at all. And when I discuss now the translation of Psalm 85 from biblical Hebrew into English, and specifically a description of how the contemporary English version did it, then these are the terms that I will be referring to. But one must realize you could have applied these strategies to any text and into any language. Now, the Hebrew title of Psalm 85 is this one. The Hebrew will read Lam Natsiach Livnei Korach Mizmor. Now, Mizmor is the technical term for a psalm, and a psalm is now supposed to be a certain kind of Hebrew, specifically Hebrew song. And literally then the text will read that this is now sort of for the overseer, the person who is in control, and literally it reads here for the sons of Korah, and that it is a psalm. And this is how they rendered it. They say it is a psalm by the people of Korah for the music leader. You see what they did is they tried to make the word music leader a little bit more understandable for the people who read this today. So the reason why the translators would have done this probably is that they actually encountered a very text-specific translation problem when they came across the word Lam Natsiach. Because the reason is that one of the problems is that the Hebrew itself is not so clear about what the role of this person is. And the Bible is also not that clear about who the sons of Korah were exactly. The question is, are they the authors? Are they the performers? And doesn't matter what group you have in mind, who were they? And about all of these things, the text of the Hebrew Bible is not entirely clear. And what the translators of the CEV now did is that they translated this in a certain way that is culturally more understandable, or relatable at least, for the people of the time, of today. If I go to the second verse, the Hebrew reads Ratzita Adonai Artsecha Shavta Shavit Yaakov. Literally then it reads, you have favored your land, O Lord. This is the four-letter word, which is the name of the Lord. That already is an important is already an important thing. If you look at what type of a translation this is, in many Jewish circles, especially, the belief is that you should not say the name out loud at all. You should rather use a type of a divine title, and if you use one, you must use a specific one, which is also culturally determined by the community in which it is read, in which the Hebrew text is read. And the fact that the translators chose this word, Lord, and the fact that they decided to write it in capital letters, that is a very important thing, which places the contemporary English version within the same tradition of a certain type of English translation. You will find that many of your older, your more classical English Bible translations would also do this. They would write the word Lord in capital letters whenever they encountered the four-letter word, the name of the Lord. Something which is important to see is that, do you see how the text is lineated? They typeset it in a certain way so that it is clear for the people reading it today that this is poetry. But they so people who read it like this hopefully will grasp immediately that what they are reading is poetry. Something which is interesting is that what the CEV is doing here now is they are using now the strategy of addition. So they're adding something that isn't necessarily there in the text. The Hebrew text just says, Lord, oh Lord, you are addressing the Lord directly. But the translators have added the possessive pronoun, our Lord. And this is probably intended to literally bring the text home for the reader of today, so that somebody who reads it today must feel, this can be also a personal prayer for me. It is not just a prayer that was done many centuries ago. And this is and the effect of this is now a classical domesticating strategy. They are presenting the text in such a way that the cultural distance between the text and the reader today must be entirely bridged. Another thing what they did is the ancient Hebrew reads the captivity of Jacob. Now, the word captivity is a technical term in the Hebrew Bible. It is something that refers to a very specific part of the history of the people of Israel. There was a time when, it goes quite far back. There was a time when a certain part of the kingdom of ancient Israel, you had Israel in the north and Judah in the south. That is already a piece of biblical history. The southern kingdom of Judah was taken into exile. They were attacked by the Babylonian Empire, and they were taken away as prisoners to the Babylon. Now, all of this is actually quite a bit of specialized history, right? It is if you translate this as you returned the captivity of Jacob, a literal translation such as this assumes that you as the reader know about the captivity. It assumes that you as the reader know who the Babylonians were. It assumes that you as the reader know where Babylon is. It assumes that you know who Jacob is. Jacob is the name of one of the patriarchs of the people of Israel. And what you see they did is they actually threw out the idea of captivity at all. They just said, you made it go well with us again. They kept the word of Jacob's descendants. So even though this translation is intended to be domesticating in nature, it does assume a little bit of background of biblical history. It would be very interesting to see what would a translation do that assumes that the readers have no background of biblical history, because for a translation that is intended for people who do not know the Bible at all, they do not know absolutely anything, they will it'll be interesting to see how they would translate something like this before, because a translation like that is intended to function within a group of people that do not know the Bible at all. You cannot use the name Jacob. They will not know what it is. So the translation tried to simplify a few things. They used A more common term. The idea is that the modern person must find it easy to understand. If I read the next verse, Nasita avon amecha kisita kol chatatam sela. And the literal translation, you lifted the iniquity of your people, you covered all their sins. And then here's a separate term, sela. And then all that the contemporary English version translators did is that they wrote, you have forgiven the sin and taken away the guilt of your people. Now here they seem to follow, the translators of the CEV follows the strategy of transposition. So they take, so from the Hebrew, which has a more specialized meaning and assumes a lot of background information from the Bible, they use they create an expression that is more easily understood by the reader of today. What you will also see is that if you look at the literal translation, you will see that what they did in the CEV is that they actually switched the two lines around. You lifted the iniquity of your people. That's the part that means you've taken away the guilt. You've covered the sins. That's the part that means you've forgiven the sins. So the translators have even decided to switch the order of the text around in translation. They felt it would make more sense to a modern reader. Something else is this word Selah. Selah is a very common term in Hebrew poetry. People are not often sure what it means. Many people think it is a kind of a pause. Many people think it is a kind of, it is the indication that there must be musical accompaniment or something like that. But the point is, regardless about whether you think you know what Selah means or not, the point is it is something that indicates the fact that this is probably a text that was intended for worship in a temple or a formal worship event. And this is some kind of an instruction for the people performing it in the real live situation. And you see that what the translators did is they simply left it untranslated. So they deleted it. They simply omitted it. But one can now decide, do you want to criticize them for it? One doesn't necessarily want to criticize a translation like this, because what were they trying to do? They told you from the beginning, we're trying to produce a translation that is supposed to be easily understood for the people of today. So if something is not easily understood for the people of today, well, they will either reformulate it into something that is easy to understand, and if they feel it's not too important, they'll simply drop it. And here they decided to drop it. So that is what they decided to do. If I can read this, verse 4. Verse numbering is also interesting. You'll see that the CEV uses different numberings. So the reason for that is might also be an interesting discussion one day. The Hebrew says, Asafta kol Efratecha Eshivota Mecharon Apecha. And then the Hebrew will read, you took away all your fury, you turned from the burning of your anger. Now, actually, what I'm now not mentioning, what I was not planning to pay too much attention to, is that actually there's something in the grammar of the Hebrew that's not entirely clear. So if you are going to translate that text, there's something in the grammar that's not clear. And you, as a translator, would have had to interpret, what do you think is going on in the grammar? For yourself, you have to solve the grammatical problem in the Hebrew. And only then can you decide, how do you think you are going to render it? And here what they do is they use the strategy of transposition. What they do is they reformulate the Hebrew of verse 4 entirely. What you also see is, we spoke a moment ago, sometimes they would add things, sometimes they would omit things, all for the fact of the easy communication. Here what you find is the translators only reflect this line. You took away your fury. Your fierce anger is no longer aimed at us. That's how the CEV rendered it. do you see that they omitted the second line entirely? One of the reasons could simply be that they decided, they just decided that it would be a too foreign concept. One of the central things of biblical Hebrew poetry is the use of parallelism. You will have short little parallel lines. Sometimes they say plus minus the same thing, sometimes plus minus the opposite, sometimes they just follow upon each other. But there is in Hebrew a reason for the second line. Sometimes the second line elaborates or clarifies, or even there's a rise in intensity, maybe even from the first to the second line. Remember, it's poetry, right? So you're conveying people's emotions and things like that. And that is often the purpose of the second line. So in the Hebrew, the second line has a purpose. But the translators felt that for their audience, that second line is either going to be redundant or they're simply not going to understand it. So they so they simply felt, look, the two lines say plus minus the same thing anyway. So if you're just trying to translate the meaning, you might as well leave the one line untranslated. And that is exactly what they did. Let me scroll down again. If I can just read verse 5, in the Hebrew, Shuvenu Elohei Yishenu V'haper Ka'ascha Imanu. And then the translation literally in the Hebrew is, turn us, O God of our salvation, and break your anger with us. Now here again is a grammatical problem in the Hebrew. This word, shuvenu, this is the word that means turn us. Now turn us literally simply means that you are turning around, right? But in the context, you can see that the idea is not to turn us. If we consider that this psalm assumes some of the background information of the captivity of Babylon. The people were almost like prisoners in Babylon, or taken away into a foreign land, into exile. Whether they were actually prisoners or not is something people debate about. But the point is, they were displaced. They were in a foreign country against their will. And you would expect not the verb turn us, but return us. So return us as in bring us home. And in Hebrew, you will find that the root of the word to return and to turn is the same, but you change something inside the word in order to give you the meaning, return us, bring us home. But the text reads only turn, and many people feel, but that is a grammatical problem. Many people feel the Hebrew actually doesn't make sense. You will have to reinterpret, or you will have to do a bit of textual criticism, reconstruct what you think the correct meaning is. The point is, the Hebrew itself is difficult. So this is an example of a text-specific translation problem. When your source text is not clear, that is a text-specific problem that Hebrew translators do come across from time to time. Now, this is maybe not so clear here, but in the presentation of the CEV that I showed you in the very beginning, when I showed you the original page layout as it was written in published in the CEV, they made a line break. They make a line break in the on the page to show that in the poetry, this is now the beginning of a new section, the beginning of a new stanza. So the reader would then, of today, would read that and realize, okay, this is the beginning of a new paragraph or a new stanza or something like that. Now, what's interesting, if we ask ourselves, how did the CEV, what strategies did they use to convey this verse? And we spoke a moment ago that the Hebrew text, the source text, is not entirely, well, there are a few problems. What they use is they use the term bring us back home. Now, what they do there is one of the ways that we do, that we try to handle text critical problems if we translate from Hebrew into whatever language, is that translators sometimes have to compare different ancient Hebrew manuscripts. And unfortunately, not everybody can have access to all the original manuscripts with all the original photographs and things like that. So what they use is text-critical editions of the Hebrew Bible. Text-critical editions of the Hebrew Bible, what they do is they take the oldest complete version of the Hebrew Bible and they print that as it is. And then at the bottom of the page, there are all sorts of footnotes that give you, that refer to readings that differ in other manuscripts. And then it is up to the translator to feel, which one do you think is the best reading to follow. So basically in your mind, you are reconstructing your source text. And they decided to, if they say, bring us back home, then what the translators did is they actually changed something in the source text. They followed a reading from a different manuscript. Something which is also important. This was now then an example of transposition, where they changed something from where they reformulated something that is not there in the source text. Something which is now interesting is the word for salvation. Now, something about the contemporary English version, and this has got to do with the purpose of the translation. I often refer to the purpose of the CEV. Any translation, when you translate any text today, any kind of foreign text, any other lingual text into any language, one of the first things you have to think about is, what is the purpose of my translation, right? Why am I translating this text? Who do you think is going to read your translation? And then you often adapt your strategies according to that. Now, one of the things that the translators of the CEV did is they assumed that the people who would read or would listen to the CEV will not understand some of the language that you would call Bible language or church language. So they avoided words like salvation. They also changed something, reformulated something in the source text. The text, the original text says, God of our salvation, but they changed it into a verbal clause, our Lord and our God, save us. So they reformulated so they reformulated something from the source text into something totally different in the target text. And because they thought that their audience will not understand a word like this, they simply didn't use it. They used something else. Let's quickly move down. The Hebrew text literally now reads, will you be angry with us forever? Will you extend your anger from generation to generation? And how the CEV renders it is here, will you always be angry with us and our families? Interesting here. You see that this is a rhetorical question. And the Hebrew is a rhetorical question as well. This is one of the ways that biblical Hebrew indicates a question. So the Hebrew is a question, and they keep it a question as well. But this is an example of what we would call cultural substitution. What they do is they take a term that is maybe they refer to the term they refer to the term in the source language, and they feel that it might be too foreign for the people who would listen to it today. So they use instead of generation for generation, they use simply the word our families. So there they focus on what is probably the translation problem of convention. Generation to generation, maybe it is not too unfamiliar in the target language, but do people today actually talk like that? And would the people that you are intending the text for actually feel that they understand this entirely when they read it? Would it make sense to them? And that is what determined their translation theory there. I think you might notice that every time when I discuss what the translators did in order to establish their translation, every time we come back to the question, what kind of a translation did the translators have in mind? Before they started their translation, they felt they want to direct a translation at a specific audience. Who do they think is this audience? What is the reading ability of this audience? What is the understanding level of this audience? And they adapted their strategies according to that. The purpose, the function of the translation for the people that it is intended for, that is what determines these translation strategies that they used. So the idea of a single definition of what equivalence is, a single definition of when is a translation correct and when it is incorrect, when it is good and when it is bad, they did not follow that concept. They had a definition of who they think it is intended for and what they think those people will understand, and they adapted their strategies accordingly. And knowingly or unknowingly, many translations intentionally or unintentionally do that as well. If we read this part, Halo ata tashuv techa yenu va'amacha yish mechu bach or vach. Will you not turn? Will you not revive us? And your people will rejoice in you. Now, once again, the CEV, at least, they retain the rhetorical question in the English translation, but they reformulate the meaning of the Hebrew into a more modern English idiom. Hebrew says, revive us, but the English says, give us fresh life. This is also an example of where they reformulated something from the source text into the target text, reflecting something totally different than what the original text actually have said. But they do so because they feel it does still convey the meaning of the original text. Remember this translation? They did not attempt to preserve the original style of the original Hebrew, and they did not pretend that they would do it either. They just wanted to focus on it must be easy to understand and it must be easy to read, and that is what they did when they created this translation. If we read the Hebrew, Har'enu Adonai chastecha v'yesh acha titen lanu. Make us see your kindness, and you will give your salvation to us. Now here we have a grammatical problem, not a grammatical problem, but here you have a situation where there is a grammatical form in the Hebrew that actually does not exist in the English. Hebrew's got a very interesting verb type. It is, in English, you have active voice and passive voice, right? In Hebrew, you have something that you would call a causative voice. That is, if you don't do something yourself, you make somebody else do it. They actually have a verb form for that. So literally, if you want to be brutally literal in how you would translate that word, you would say this. Cause us to see your kindness. Now, I think even in Hebrew, even in English, you can hear this is a totally foreign formulation. Even if you are somebody who speaks English as a home language and maybe a certain level of English, I think any speaker of English would find this strange today. But that's literally what the Hebrew says. And what they had to do is they had to reformulate once again. So they took the original Hebrew and they reformulated into something totally different in translation. The Hebrew expression, give us your salvation, it is rendered as a single imperative, save us. So it is a strategy of transposition. And the English expression, give your salvation to us, would simply be more easily understood by the intended audience of the contemporary English version. Here is a text where there are also quite a few problems. You remember one of the things that the CEV said in the beginning is that they want to present poetry as poetry. People must realize that something is poetry when they see it in the text. But unfortunately, it is not always that simple. In Hebrew, we are not always so sure where the poetic lines divide. You have to interpret the text. You have to motivate for yourself. Where do you think the line breaks are going to be? What grammatical features do you, as a translator, see that makes you feel where do the lines break? Where do the paragraphs divide? So to say that you're just going to print something so that people know it's poetry is not that simple either. This is an example of a text-specific problem. On the one hand, they want to print something as poetry, and they do, but how the poetic lines are actually divided in the Hebrew is not entirely clear. This is this is now an example where you have text critically a very problematic verse. And the CEV makes extensive use of transposition and also deletion. They delete stuff by adopting a single interpretation, and they simply communicate it clearly. And this is now also a unique feature of this type of translation, and specifically the CEV. Sometimes in modern Bible translations, if there is something in the text that's difficult to understand, they will print a certain translation, and they will maybe give a footnote to say, okay, and here's a different way to translate it, right? What the CEV did, they say, no, we are simply going to choose a translation. And we are going to say what we think the text means and publish that and print that clearly. So they, and this is once again in line with their original intention, their original intention and what type of translation they hope to produce. If we read this, Ach karov lire av yish'o lishkon kavod be artsenu. And then the literal translation, surely his salvation is clear to those fearing him, glory to dwell in our land. That is the literal translation. And here you can immediately see glory to dwell in our land. What does that mean? You get the feeling that maybe here is a grammatical problem as well in the text. And you see what the CEV did. They simply tried to smooth it over in a way. They tried to be consistent in their translation approach. They want to formulate something that is easy to understand. What they do is, by the strategy of transposition, they chose to use more familiar words. What they also did, if you want to see, remember now transposition is if you reformulate the grammar from the original entirely to the point where you are presenting something in translation which isn't there, which is totally different from what the original says. Here they say, his salvation is near. That's third person masculine singular pronoun. What do? They translate it as if it is a direct form of address. Scroll down again. Once again, in the text, they present this as the beginning of a new line. So in the contemporary English version, they make a line break to show that this is the beginning of a new stanza, the beginning of a new paragraph, a new stanza. Now here they also use the strategy of transposition. Maybe you are picking up the transposition to reformulate something from the grammar into the translation to the point where the grammar of the translation does not reflect the grammar of the original. This is something that they used a lot. And here is something where I think they were almost forced to do it. Here is a very strange expression, I think, for many people. Righteousness and peace have kissed. Now, obviously, that is a certain kind of a metaphor, and it will obviously have a certain kind of meaning. But you will see the only thing that the translators did is they said that goodness and peace will unite. They don't use the word righteousness either, because it is a term that simply would not have been easily understood for the people of today. One must realize once again, the CEV is intended to be an easily readable and understandable translation. If we read this verse, which is now similar to the previous one that we just read, I'll just read the literal English translation. truth will sprout from earth and righteousness has looked down from heaven. And then the translation that they give, loyalty will sprout from the ground, justice will look down from the sky above. Now the CEV, once again, it intends to be understandable for people who are unfamiliar with Bible language, right? So technical terms that would be understandable for those who are familiar with Bible language, that's the type of thing that they try to avoid. So one can understand why they would rather choose the word loyalty instead of the word truth, because truth has a technical meaning in the Hebrew Bible and even in some Bible reading circles today. If I can maybe skip to the last verse, because I see my time is almost up. Tzedek lefanav yehalech v'yasem lederech be'amav. Righteousness will march forth before his presence, and let it set the way of his footsteps. Now, this text, if one reads it in different translations, especially your older English translations, the verb here, it is not entirely clear who is the subject of the verb. Is it the Lord who will pave the way of his footsteps for his footsteps to come, or is it righteousness that will set the way of his footsteps? So here you have a situation where the Hebrew text, according to some people, might be unclear. But here is something where one must really commend the translators of the CEV. They really went through a lot of trouble here to convey the meaning of the poetry. Many Bible translations, even many respected established English translations, will say the Lord is the one who will establish the way for him to come, for his presence to enter the land, right? But if you take seriously that this is a parallelism, so these two lines belong together. And the way it usually works is that you have two parallel lines. There's some relationship between the two. The second line somehow moves beyond the first one. The second line clarifies something in the first line, or raises the intensity from the first to the second line in a parallelism. Then, if you take that seriously, then the word justice is the subject of the verb to establish the way. So the translation should be something like, justice, righteousness will set the way will march forth before the Lord's presence, and may justice pave the way for his steps to come. So that is so the subject of the verb in the second line comes from the first line. It's not the Lord who is one of the subjects several lines earlier. So what they did in the CEV, even though they reformulated, they do say justice will march in front, and it is justice that will be making a path for you to follow. So this is something where one can see from the translation, even though they did not generate a literal translation at all, it is quite clear that the translators of the CEV, they did understand the Hebrew correctly, and they tried to convey that as best they could in this situation. If I can make just a few concluding remarks, we've seen that the contemporary English version, and one could have actually now compared any kind of translation, right? The translation had a certain intention in mind for a certain audience. The idea is that it must be understood immediately by the listener when it is read aloud, and the person who reads it must be able to do so without stumbling. So the strategies that they employed was intended that the end product must have simplified language, and although the strategies that they follow include things that they would sometimes add things, sometimes delete things, the predominant translation strategy is the one of transposition. Transposition, where you, if I can maybe go back to the definitions here. Oops. Transposition, a translation strategy involving a change in grammatical form from the source language to the target language. So you will see that in the discussion so far, when we compared, this is the translation strategy used the most in the contemporary English version. And it is this all causes that it is a thoroughly domesticating translation. People who read it today might not grasp that this is actually an ancient text that is removed from us in language, culture, and space. That is unfortunately lost to the reader. But it is clear that all their translation decisions was based on their predefined definition and conception. How and where will the translation function? All right, that is all from my side. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Francois, and hello, everyone. I apologize deeply for my technical difficulties a little while ago, but shalom and hello, everyone. And thank you, Francois, for this wonderful and very fascinating presentation. There are several comments that we're not going to have a lot of time to, or any time really, to give some attention to, but I just want to give a shout out to Emmanuel Juarez, to David Aparicio Ramirez, to Veronica Lagos, to Juan Castañeda for your comments and your questions. Francois, can you give us an email or some way to contact you, because there are really good questions in the chat. And we're not going to be able to take them right now because we have our next presenter.
I will do so. Let me quickly send my email address. I'll send it to everybody. There we go. francoisv@eteachergroup.com. And you are more than welcome to contact me. There you go.
Well, thank you once again. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was a great pleasure, and I hope and I wish you great success for your conference. Take care of yourselves, and good night. Shalom.
Shalom. Thank you very much, Francois. And for all of our participants, there's the email that you can find in your chat right there. It's francoisv@eteachergroup.com. And here's the certificate of participation that we're going to be sending Francois for your collaboration with us. It basically says it's a participation proof for you as a lecturer in the International Congress of Language Learning that was celebrated from the 6th to the 8th of April of 2022, and it's signed by the general coordinator of the event, Karina Godina, who you also know. And please, we didn't get a chance to answer any of your questions, but please write to Francois. Tell him give him your thoughts and your doubts and everything like that, because translation is, as Emmanuel was actually saying, it's very, very complicated, very precise. And it's not that easy as many people would think about, So thank you once again, and I want to just give another shout out also to our sponsors, ITEP, to Anglo Morelia, and to Innova Brains. Thank you for all of your help for us to have this international congress. And I guess right now, Maestra Karina, you're going to give way to our last lecturer of today.
Yes, Jaime, I think you can take 1 minute to read one of the most important messages for Francois. And as you can see, Francois, we had the certificate for your participation today. We will be sending you to your email directly. But I have seen that you have a lot of messages, so...
Yeah, there are a lot of questions from Emmanuel Juarez asking, like, what is a translation team like? Like, is it just one person dedicating themselves completely to one psalm? Do they have an oversight? Are there editors? Are there revisionists? Juan Castañeda, that's a question by Juan Castañeda. David asks if you could recommend any specific translated version, or which one do you work with? Emmanuel also talks about the similarities between Hispanic Latin languages and the Hebrew and Arab, also about how the key to translating And understanding the language can really be reduced to understanding the roots, to the lexema and to the grammemas in the language. And he also asks, why do translations insist on using the word Adonai if we're translating for another culture, if they are not obligated by, say, Hebrew tradition to substitute the word for the tetragrammaton, you know?
All of that are very interesting questions. And the thing is, I think it actually goes back to the first question: what is a translation team like? Because the thing is, you will find one of the ways to study translation is actually also the process behind it. Because yes, there is oversight. You have different committees making comments on each other's work, motivating why they did what they did. And look, and people don't always agree, even within translation organizations, about it. And you will find, for example, if you compare an English translation, I can't remember if it's the New American Bible or Authorized American Bible or something like that. But they, for example, decided deliberately that they are going to transliterate the four-letter word, the proper name of the Lord. And the result was that the translation was rejected by the Bible reading public. So the thing is, there are many, there is no single correct way to do that, because a lot depends on the tradition within which you translate and who the Bible is intended for, right? If you are translating for a group of people for whom it will be acceptable to hear the word said out loud, then that's what you do. But if you are translating for a group of people that either they're not going to understand what the word means, or it's going to be unacceptable, then you don't use it. So once again, it goes back to the question: who are you translating for, and who is your anticipated audience when you translate? And a lot of your strategies will be determined by that. But I mean, all of us here are in translation, and all of us, consciously or unconsciously, we all do that. Whenever we translate, don't we all ask ourselves, okay, will the people understand this? Don't we all do this? And one must realize that obviously for a Bible translation team, it would be the same question as well. And that answer will determine what they do with the name of the Lord, the four-letter word. There we go.
Okay.
Thank you very much for everybody's time. It was a great privilege to be here, and I am very honored to could have been invited. And I wish you all great success. And I hope that I will be able to see all of you again sometime.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Take care of yourselves. Thank you.
Okay, have a great.
I'm afraid I will have to be off because I'm actually going to teach now myself. And hopefully I will see you later again. Good evening to all of you. Shalom. Bye-bye.
Thank you,
Shalom.
Francois.
Good night.
See you.
Good evening,
Thank you,
everybody.
Jaime.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.